On December 25th, 1991, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. To the outside world, it looked like a political collapse, a victory for democracy, a defeat for communism, a system finally crushed by its own ideology. But if you had been standing inside the Soviet Ministry of Finance that week, you would have seen a very different reality. You would have seen empty accounts, unpaid bills, and a government that could no longer write checks. The Soviet Union did not collapse because people suddenly stopped believing in communism. It did not collapse because of protests, speeches, or ideology. It collapsed for the simplest reason imaginable. It ran out of money. This is the story of the largest bankruptcy in modern history. A superpower that possessed tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, controlled half of Europe, and sent the first human into space, but could not afford to buy bread for its own citizens. To understand how that could happen, you have to go back to the moment the Soviet Union thought it had solved all of its problems. The year was 1965. In the frozen wastelands of western Siberia, Soviet geologists made a discovery that would change everything. They found oil, not a modest reserve, not a temporary fix, a vast sea of black gold buried beneath the tundra. For the Soviet leadership, it felt like salvation. The communist system was already showing cracks. Factories were inefficient. Consumer goods were scarce. Agriculture was chronically underperforming. But suddenly, none of that seemed to matter. The Soviet Union did not need to compete with the West on quality or innovation. It just needed to pump oil. Throughout the 1970s, oil prices surged. The OPEC embargo sent shockwaves through global markets, and Moscow became one of the biggest beneficiaries. Billions of dollars in hard currency flowed into Soviet coffers. For the first time, the Soviet Union could buy whatever it needed from the outside world. The leadership mistook this windfall for strength. They believed they were rich. They believed the system worked, and they stopped fixing what was broken. Oil money made reform unnecessary. Why modernize factories when you could sell crude? Why overhaul agriculture when you could import grain? Why risk political instability by changing the system when money was pouring in? The Soviet economy became addicted. What looked like prosperity was dependency, and dependency is invisible until the supply disappears. By the late 1970s, the oil money had transformed the Soviet state. On the surface, everything looked stable. Bread was cheap, rent was symbolic, jobs were guaranteed. The red flag still flew over half of Europe. To the outside world, the Soviet Union looked immovable, but stability was being bought, not built. The Kremlin used oil revenue to subsidize almost everything. Food prices were kept artificially low. Housing costs were frozen. Entire industries that should have failed were kept alive by state transfers. Loyalty in Eastern Europe was purchased with cheap energy and direct financial support. The military absorbed an enormous share of national output, consuming resources without producing anything civilians could use. None of this generated growth. It only generated silence. The Soviet Union stopped making things the world wanted to buy. Its factories produced goods that were outdated, unreliable, and uncompetitive. Consumer products were embarrassing compared to what rolled off assembly lines in the West. So instead of exporting finished goods, the Soviet Union exported raw materials, oil, gas, metals. It became a classic resource economy. Sell what comes out of the ground. Use the proceeds to import everything else. Food, machinery, technology, even basic consumer items. The most dangerous weakness was agriculture. Despite controlling some of the most fertile land on Earth, particularly in Ukraine, the Soviet Union could not feed itself. The collective farm system was catastrophically inefficient. Crops rotted before reaching cities. Transport failures were routine. Incentives were non-existent. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing millions of tons of grain every year just to avoid famine. And it was buying that grain from its ideological enemy, the United States. Half of the Soviet Union's hard currency earnings were being spent on food imports alone. Oil was pumped out of Siberia, shipped west, sold for dollars, and then those same dollars were sent back to America to buy wheat. It was dependency disguised as power. Inside the Kremlin, this was understood, but not confronted. As long as oil prices remained high, the numbers still worked. The leadership convinced itself that the windfall would last forever. They built budgets assuming expensive oil. They made promises assuming permanent abundance, and the math changed. In the early 1980s, demand for oil began to fall. Western economies became more energy efficient. New supplies came online from Alaska and the North Sea. The market softened. Prices wobbled. At the same time, the Soviet Union was bleeding money abroad. The war in Afghanistan was consuming billions. Support for allied regimes in Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, and Eastern Europe drained more resources every year. And the arms race with the United States intensified, forcing massive spending just to maintain parity. Still, the system might have limped along if oil prices had held. They didn't. In 1985, a decision made thousands of miles away sealed the Soviet Union's fate. Saudi Arabia, tired of propping up prices, opened the taps. Oil flooded the market. prices collapsed. In just a few years, oil fell from over $30 a barrel to near 10. For the Soviet Union, it was a financial catastrophe. Half of its income vanished almost overnight. But its obligations did not. The military still needed funding. The grain ships still demanded payment. The subsidies still had to be paid. The system had been built for abundance. Now it was facing scarcity, and there was no backup plan. The collapse in oil prices exposed a problem the Soviet leadership could no longer ignore. The country did not just have a budget shortfall, it had a hard currency crisis. Rubles could pay wages inside the Soviet Union, but they were worthless outside it. You could not use rubles to buy American grain, German machinery, or Japanese electronics. For that, you needed dollars or gold, and those were disappearing fast. By the mid-1980s, nearly every shipment of food arriving at Soviet ports demanded payment in hard currency. Grain ships waited offshore until the checks cleared. The world's largest land empire was living delivery to delivery, week to week, hoping the next oil sale would cover the next food bill. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he believed the system could still be fixed. He thought the Soviet economy had a cold. In reality, it had terminal cancer. His plan was restructuring, modernize industry, improve efficiency, compete again. But restructuring required investment. Investment required cash. The cash was gone. Gorbachev assumed oil revenues would fund reform. Instead, they collapsed even further. At the worst possible moment, the Soviet budget imploded. Tens of billions of dollars vanished from state accounts. Faced with impossible math, the Kremlin made a fateful choice. It borrowed. Western banks were eager to lend. This was a superpower, after all. A nuclear giant with massive territory and huge gold reserves. To bankers in London, Frankfurt, and Paris, Soviet debt looked safe. Governments do not go bankrupt. Empires do not default. They were wrong. The loans did not finance new factories or productive industries. They paid for survival, grain, meat, consumer goods to keep shelves from going completely bare. The Soviet Union was borrowing to eat. At the same time, Gorbachev made a domestic decision that accelerated the collapse. He launched an aggressive anti-alcohol campaign. Vodka was destroying productivity and public health, so sales were restricted and vineyards were destroyed. Morally, it made sense. Economically, it was disastrous. Taxes on alcohol were one of the largest sources of state revenue, second only to oil. By slashing vodka sales, the government erased another massive stream of income. People did not stop drinking. They brewed at home. The state collected nothing. By 1988, the deficit was exploding. The government turned to the last tool available. It printed money. Rubles flooded the economy, but there were no goods to buy. This created a monetary overhang. People had cash in their pockets, but store shelves were empty. Lines stretched for hours. If people saw a queue, they joined it without knowing what was being sold. Shoes, sausages, toilet paper, anything. The social contract was breaking. For decades, the Soviet people had accepted limited freedom in exchange for stability. Now the stability was gone. Money meant nothing. Goods vanished. Trust evaporated. And the outside world was watching closely. Western banks noticed that new loans were being used to pay interest on old ones. Debt had exploded from nearly zero to tens of billions in just a few years. The realization spread quietly through financial circles. The Soviet Union was insolvent. Once the realization set in, events moved quickly. The banks began to pull back. Credit tightened. The easy borrowing that had kept the system alive vanished. Inside the Soviet Union, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Gold reserves began to disappear. For decades, the Soviet Union had boasted of vast stockpiles of gold hidden away in secure vaults. By the late 1980s, those reserves were being quietly flown out of the country and sold in Western markets. Plane after plane carried bars to London and Zurich, dumped at fire sale prices to raise just enough cash to cover the next shipment of food. The desperation showed. As the central government struggled, the outer layers of the empire began to fracture. Eastern European satellite states broke free. To the world, it looked like liberation. To the accountants in Moscow, it was a disaster. For decades, trade inside the Soviet bloc had operated in a closed loop. Prices were controlled. Payments were internal. Now those countries demanded hard currency. The loop collapsed. Inside the Soviet Union itself, the situation turned chaotic. The republics began to withhold tax revenue from the center. Leaders in Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltics realized that Moscow could no longer enforce financial discipline. Boris Yeltsin, leading the Russian Republic, instructed tax collectors to keep money at home. The central budget evaporated. Gorbachev was now president of a superpower with no income. The government could not pay workers. It could not pay soldiers. It could not even pay the guards protecting strategic facilities. Suppliers demanded cash before unloading cargo. Ships full of meat and butter sat offshore, refusing to dock because payments had not cleared. The unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union began defaulting. To keep the system alive, the state confiscated hard currency earnings from its own companies. Accounts were frozen overnight. Export firms that had earned dollars woke up to find their balances emptied by decree. Trust collapsed instantly. Contracts became meaningless. No one believed the government would honor its obligations. Money stopped functioning. The economy reverted to barter. Factories paid workers in whatever they produced: tires, glassware, machinery parts. Workers then tried to trade those goods for food on the side of the road. The black market became the real economy. The dollar became the real currency. Professors, engineers, and scientists were suddenly poor. Taxi drivers and waiters with access to foreign cash became the new elite. The system had inverted. In August 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup. Tanks rolled into Red Square. The leaders believed force could restore order. But there was nothing left to restore. You cannot shoot a balance sheet. The coup collapsed, not because of ideology alone, but because everyone involved understood the truth. The state was bankrupt. There was no money to pay anyone, no money to buy food, no money to hold the country together. The Soviet Union was already gone. In the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed only on paper. The institutions remained. The flags still flew. But the state itself was hollow. There was no money for November payrolls. There was no money for December. Printing presses ran day and night, flooding the economy with large denomination banknotes that were worth less every hour they existed. Hyperinflation had arrived. Inside the central bank, Gazbank, officials faced the ultimate humiliation. The gold was gone. The legendary reserves that had underwritten Soviet power for decades had been sold, stolen, or exhausted in a frantic attempt to delay the inevitable. And when investigators later counted what remained, they found only a fraction of what had once been claimed. On December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat at his desk and resigned. He did not resign because the Soviet Union had been invaded. He resigned because he could no longer govern a country that could not pay its bills. The red flag was lowered, not by revolution, but by insolvency. The collapse created a new problem almost immediately. The Soviet Union had debts, massive ones, nearly $70 billion owed to Western banks and governments. And now the country that owed that money no longer existed. The creditors demanded an answer. In the negotiations that followed, the newly formed Russian Federation agreed to take responsibility for all Soviet foreign debt in exchange for claiming all Soviet foreign assets, embassies, accounts, whatever gold remained. It was called the zero option. One state inherited everything, including the burden. That burden crushed the new Russia. Throughout the 1990s, interest payments strangled the economy. There was no money to cushion the transition. Subsidies vanished overnight. Prices for food exploded. Savings were wiped out. Millions were thrown into poverty almost instantly. The suffering of the post-Soviet years was not the result of freedom arriving too fast. It was the delayed consequence of decades of economic addiction. The Soviet Union had confused resources with wealth. It believed oil made it strong. It believed ideology made it permanent. In reality, it had built a superpower on a single volatile commodity and borrowed against the future to maintain the illusion. When oil prices fell, the illusion collapsed. In the end, the Cold War was not decided by missiles or speeches. It was decided by grain shipments the Soviet Union could not afford to buy. An empire that cannot feed itself cannot survive. An empire that cannot pay its debts cannot exist. The Soviet Union did not fall. It went bankrupt.